Genesis chapter 13 recounts the separation of Abram, later known as Abraham, and his nephew Lot due to their growing wealth and the need for more land. Here's a summary of the key events. Before we start, we'd like to ask for your support. If you enjoy our video, please hit the like button. This will help us reach more people and create content for you. Now let's get started with today's video, Genesis chapter 13, the separation of Abram and Lot. Introduction to Abram's return to Canaan. Genesis 13, 1-4. After a brief sojourn in Egypt due to a severe famine, Abram, later known as Abraham, returns to the land of Canaan, the place of God's promise. Abram's journey to Egypt is considered by many scholars as a lapse in faith, as he relied on human reasoning rather than trusting in God's provision during the famine. His return to Canaan signifies a return to the path of faith and obedience. Abram, his wife Sarai, later known as Sarah, and his nephew Lot, along with all their possessions and livestock, make their way back to the region between Bethel and Ai. This is a significant location for Abram. It was here in Genesis 12 that Abram had first built an altar to the Lord. Upon his return, Abram immediately resumes his worship, calling upon the name of the Lord, verse 4. This act of worship emphasizes Abram's relationship with God and his dependence on divine guidance as he reestablishes himself in Canaan. Abram's growing wealth in the conflict, Genesis 13, 5-7. Abram and Lot had become very wealthy, and their flocks, herds, and tents had grown significantly. Wealth in the ancient Near East was often measured in terms of livestock and land. Both men had accumulated such great wealth that the land they shared could no longer sustain them. Their increased prosperity led to conflict, not between Abram and Lot directly, but between their herdsmen. The tension is indicative of the practical challenges that come with material wealth. The text mentions the presence of the Canaanites and Perizzites in the land. Verse 7. This note is crucial for two reasons. First, it highlights that Abram and Lot are living as sojourners in a land not yet their own, which adds a sense of vulnerability to their position. Second, the presence of these other groups intensifies the issue of limited resources, further escalating the conflict over grazing land. Abram's humility and proposal for peace, Genesis 13, 8-9. Recognizing the potential for escalating tension, Abram takes the initiative to prevent further conflict. His approach is one of remarkable humility and wisdom. He says to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are brethren." Verse 8. By referring to Lot as his brother, though Lot is his nephew, Abram appeals to their familial bond and underscores the importance of peace and unity within the family. Abram's solution is generous and selfless. He offers Lot the first choice of the land, saying, "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right, or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Verse 9. This offer reveals Abram's faith in God's promise. He is not concerned with securing the best land for himself because he trusts that God will fulfill his promise regardless of the circumstances. Abram's willingness to allow Lot to choose first shows a stark contrast between Abram's character and the natural inclination toward self-interest. It also illustrates a broader biblical principle. Peace and relationships are more important than material wealth or personal gain. Lot's choice and its implications, Genesis 13, 10-13. Lot's response to Abram's proposal is immediate and pragmatic. He surveys the land and chooses the fertile plain of the Jordan Valley, which was well watered and reminded him of the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Verse 10. Lot's choice seems logical from a materialistic perspective. The Jordan Valley was a lush and fertile region, ideal for agriculture and livestock. However, the text foreshadows the moral and spiritual dangers associated with Lot's decision by noting that this region included the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were known for their wickedness. Verse 13. Lot's decision to settle near Sodom reveals a critical flaw in his judgment. While the land may have seemed prosperous, the moral and spiritual environment was toxic. This passage teaches a valuable lesson about the consequences of prioritizing material wealth and comfort over spiritual integrity. Lot's choice sets the stage for future calamities, as he will eventually be caught in the crossfire of Sodom's destruction. In contrast, Abram remains in the land of Canaan, the land of promise. Although Lot's choice might seem like the better one from a worldly perspective, Abram's decision to trust in God rather than rely on the apparent advantages of the Jordan Valley will prove to be the wiser
choice in the long run. God's renewed promise to Abram, Genesis 13:14-17. After Lot departs, God speaks to Abram once again. The Lord renews and expands his earlier promises to Abram. God tells Abram to lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are northward, southward, eastward, and westward. v.14. God reassures Abram that all the land he sees will belong to him and his descendants forever. This reiteration of the promise serves to remind Abram that his future and the future of his descendants are secure in God's hands. In addition to the land, God also promises Abram countless descendants. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. v.16. This is a remarkable promise, especially considering that Abram and Sarai are childless at this point. The promise of innumerable descendants emphasizes the vastness of God's plans for Abram and the pivotal role he will play in the unfolding of salvation history. God's command to Abram in verse 17, "Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you," is an invitation to Abram to explore and take possession of the land by faith. Although Abram does not yet physically possess the land, God wants him to embrace the promise as a present reality. Abram's response: building an altar in Hebron, Genesis 13:18. Abram responds to God's promise with worship. He moves his tent to the area near Hebron, to the oaks of Mamre, and builds an altar to the Lord. This act of building an altar is significant for two reasons. First, it symbolizes Abram's deepening relationship with God and his recognition of God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Second, it marks the land as holy, consecrated to God. Abram's altars are not just places of worship, they are also physical manifestations of his faith in the promises of God. The location of Hebron is also noteworthy. Hebron will later become a significant city in the biblical narrative, serving as the place where David is crowned king of Israel, 2 Samuel 2:1-4. It is also a place rich with spiritual significance, being associated with God's covenant with Abram and later with the burial site of the patriarchs. Themes and lessons from Genesis 13. The primacy of faith over material wealth. The contrast between Abram and Lot's decisions highlights a central theme in the biblical narrative. Faith and obedience to God are more important than material prosperity. Abram's willingness to let Lot choose the best land reveals his trust in God's provision, while Lot's decision to prioritize material gain over spiritual integrity foreshadows his later troubles. The story serves as a warning against the dangers of worldly ambition and the consequences of living in a morally compromised environment. God's sovereignty and faithfulness throughout the chapter. God's faithfulness to his promises is a central focus. Despite the apparent disadvantages of Abram's situation, God reassures him that his promises remain intact. Abram's faith in God's sovereignty allows him to act with humility and generosity. The renewal of God's promise to Abram after Lot's departure underscores that God's plans are not dependent on human circumstances but on his divine will. The importance of peace and unity. Abram's proactive approach to resolving the conflict between his herdsmen and Lot's is a powerful example of the biblical principle of seeking peace and unity, especially within the family. Abram's selflessness and willingness to give up his rights for the sake of peace reflect the kind of humility and love that Jesus later embodies in the New Testament. Philippians 2:3-4. The chapter encourages believers to prioritize relationships over personal gain and to trust God for their ultimate provision. The consequences of poor spiritual decisions. Lot's choice to settle near Sodom illustrates the consequences of making decisions based solely on worldly criteria without considering spiritual implications. Although the land of Sodom appeared attractive, it was a place of great moral decay. Lot's decision would ultimately lead to his entanglement in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19. This story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of compromising one's spiritual integrity for material gain. Please subscribe my YouTube channel. I hope you like this video. Thank you.